Okay, good morning everyone. Can everyone hear me well? Awesome, great. So we're talking about media bias today, and before I start introducing any of the ideas and concepts that we're going to discuss today, I'd like us to have a look at this picture. So as we've seen recently in the media coverage of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, and as I think we've also discussed at some points within the framework of this ongoing workshop, there has been quite a discrepancy in the media representation of the situation in Palestine and the situation in Ukraine, which are, if you ask me, quite different, but maybe on a superficial level we can see some sort of maybe similarities. What we see here is a caricature by Carlos Latouf, who draws a lot of interesting criticism in visual form for Mondo Wise, which is an alternative news outlet online that is dedicated to issues of Palestine. Also includes a lot of writing by Palestinian journalists from Palestine, so I can recommend that if you haven't been aware of that website. But what we see here is a television screen that displays basically the same situation in two different contexts, and the only difference that we see is the flag, whereas as we've seen in the media representation of last weeks and months, white people who have taken arms in Ukraine against the Russian invasion have been oftentimes presented as heroes, and their resistance or struggle has been amplified as something positive or liberating in parts of Western mainstream media, whereas of course at the same time, when we look at Palestine, a situation of over a century of ongoing settler colonial genocide is still not presented as such, and oftentimes Palestinians who are struggling for their survival are shown as terrorists. Now, this is not always the case, but I think that this caricature shows very well the discrepancy in how two situations that might be similar can be represented in very different ways. What we want to do today is to discuss how did we get here in 2022 and why those tropes, languages, and pictures that we see are still so dominant in the mainstream media. And to answer these questions, we need to talk about media bias, its dimensions, its effects, and its histories. Our goal for today is to identify what media bias is, how it works, and also, of course, discuss effective ways to analyze and confront media bias, because as scholars, academics, or practitioners of media, we constantly need to expand our media literacy and apply concepts that we are aware of, that we learn, to ongoing and new situations, such as we've seen in the representation of this ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Bias, of course, is not just an event. So the situation here is neither a coincidence, but it's also not a conspiracy. Bias comes in different structures, and we should be able to find ways to dismantle bias and make it visible. So for today, I will include a lot of examples on Palestine, but also on Lebanon, because after all, we're also speaking here from Beirut, which is, we are on liberated land. I think right now it's the last week of May, which marks 22 years, the anniversary since the liberation of Lebanon. So throughout this lecture, I will have references to colonialism and to liberation, because effectively also, speaking from a media perspective, dismantling bias is important for us in regard to seeking justice and freedom. Now, I'll just briefly start with some theoretical input to figure out what bias is, then we'll look into the different forms of bias, and then we'll do some sort of analysis together. So, as already mentioned, bias is something that's omnipresent, that takes many shapes and forms, and appears in different forms of media. We'll focus today more on news stories and bias in news reporting. And what bias does is that it naturalizes and makes normal, or makes different ideologies appear normal, and it shapes our understanding of the world, and we'll look into how it does so today. But it also shapes our perspectives on different things, our opinions, and the ways that we analyze our everyday lives and the situations around us and societies we live in. Now, when teaching media and communication, I've come across the words neutrality and objectivity quite often, as this is something that many of our students mention when they talk about what their ideals are for media. But of course, so we often think of neutrality and objectivity as something that should be there inherently in media. We think about media as taking a moral responsibility, because after all, media is the fourth estate or the fourth power in a democracy, in a democratic framework, in a constitutional framework. It does have it is attributed a major role in guarding democracy, free speech, and creating discourse, and of course in creating a pluralist society. But as we see more often than not, these are ideals or these are goals that we might want to create, but are not necessarily there in the biased media reporting, especially if we're talking about Palestine. So when we talk about media bias, we'll look into news stories and how they are constructed through bias. But even before we look into a news outlet or a media or a news story, bias takes place. Bias takes place through selection. So by viewing a newspaper, we already have a selection made of what has become newsworthy and what has not. So there is a filtering already taking place before an eventual text or picture arrives in front of our eyes. And there are, of course, different factors that shape the forming of a news story, again, before we even get to the news story. And these include, as you mentioned, ideologies. So we can think about different news outlets, what ideologies they have, what ideologies individual journalists, staff writers, editors have, and so on. Political beliefs and orientations that play a major role. Here we can think about political parallelism, political affiliations of news outlets with parties, movements, governments, and so on. The question of literacy, who is being addressed by which media outlet in which way and what is the goal. And of course, editorial policies, such as the style and language and guidelines that people who are writing and creating media are affected by or restricted by. And they're not necessarily visible to us as consumers of individual news stories. And of course, the media system in which the media outlet operates in. If we look at any news report, we need to take into consideration not only the news report as such, but also the outlet in which it appears and the media system in which it appears, and media systems can be very different from country to country, but also within countries. And of course, the political economy, the ownership, who owns what, which is another thing that we need to be very aware of, and we need to be able to analyze, speaking again about media literacy, but of course also the question of money, because we do live in a global state of capitalism, where entertainment and the reproduction of capitalism, of course, also plays a major role in the distribution of media. So, before we go into detail, just a couple of words about frames and categories. As you know, there's been a lot of research done on framings and of how particular stories include and exclude individual details. But I just want to refer briefly to Edelman to an essay that is now almost 30 years ago, in which he demonstrated how what we know about the nature of the social world of our society, of the world we live in, depends on how we frame and interpret the cues we receive about the world. And the example that the author introduced was that in many cases, in this case, a war may be named a noble crusade, in which case the killing of innocent civilians and the profiteering the conflict brings, for example, are minimized, or it may be labeled as an act of unjustified aggression. Again, thinking of the example that we looked at between Palestine, the difference between Palestine and Ukraine a couple of minutes ago. So it is the causes and consequences that depend on the framing. There are, and I think we also talked about this recently, another lecture, episodic framing, where a particular event is shown outside of its actual context, where we are not aware of the causes and consequences. And again, Palestine is such a case, and we'll look into a couple of examples in a moment. But we need to ask ourselves questions of what is displayed, what is hidden, and how those categories that are being presented to us help shape our beliefs and fears, or maybe even extend our enthusiasm. Because effectively what happens through those framings and categories and bias is that propaganda can be neutralized and normalized into news or mere descriptions or depictions of something. Let's have a look at 3 different covers from The Economist, and I think we're all familiar with. What we can see here is from different decades, titles that are where war is framed in different situations. So what we see here is that war, the situation of war, can be very well justified and naturalized by the media. I think Dr. King mentioned in her lecture last week the concept of militainment. And so when we think about militainment, we think about how there is an entertainment, particularly in Western media, in which the situation of war, or the idea that war necessarily has to take place somewhere naturally, is normalized. But whereas the major audiences here only perceive this war through their television screens or newspapers, are not directly affected by it. So such visual depictions and those words attributed to them can very well affect our understandings of what war is. So here we have the headline, why war should be justified. So the suggestion is that there should be a war. And then Economist tells us why Ukraine must win. So we're taking a side here. And these are just examples, of course, of many different title covers that have been reproduced in such ways for the past decades. Now, to add a couple of more words to the issue of framings and categories, of course, is when we look into any sort of news outlet, we find different categories of news, including regional, national news, economics, weather, and so on. And all of these categories are, we have news stories that are classified in different categories, but oftentimes, as has been argued by Edelman, who I'm referring to again, the categorization of news within a news outlet oftentimes may obscure the links between those individual news stories. And this, of course, is very important in order to maintain hierarchies, because in many ways, dominant and mainstream media is reproducing social structures as we know them today, and thus also reproducing inequalities from an economic and social perspective, as well as, of course, power relations. So bias can oftentimes contribute to the reproduction or to the strengthening of the current status quo, and of course, the reproduction and naturalization of constructed concepts such as race, class, or gender. And again, to go back to the previous point, to engineer difference and distance where there is not. So if we think about current issues that affect different economies, be it in Lebanon or be it in the United States, we think about homelessness, the lack of healthcare, pandemic, and individual issues that are very closely tied together. They might be presented as autonomous issues that have nothing to do with one another, as Edelman has also argued. And an example that he cited was that social problems like poverty, unemployment, discrimination against minorities and women are not recognized as advantages for elites, even though they are a major benefit for them. For employers, widespread poverty and high unemployment mean lower labor costs and thus our workforce. For white males, discrimination against minorities and women mean better jobs and reduced competition. So we see our individual moments of suffering are very well connected, but they are not presented as those necessarily in the mainstream reporting of these issues, again, which are presented as individual ones. So just to give you a couple of ideas of how it is also our work by expanding our media literacy to try to connect these individual problems. And of course, as we've seen with the pictures that I just showed you from The Economist, bias can also kill, because it can justify war, it can justify the killing of people, and in the case of Palestine, it can also justify genocide. I'll briefly introduce to you a couple of different ways or different forms of bias, and then we'll analyze a couple of news stories together to see how different forms of bias can appear within one particular text or news story. So as I already mentioned, we have the bias that takes place through selection. So what becomes newsworthy? When does an event become a story? In some cases, stories become events, the other way around. And journalists do make conscious choices of what to include and what to exclude. from their reporting. And then, so once we actually have an article, we need to look into the placement. Where is a story placed, which category or which part of a newspaper is it placed in? And of course, the placing determines readers' perception. Some readers may just read the first pages of newspapers or skim through the headlines. So this, of course, makes an impact on the audience, but then also within a news story, we need to look into how a story is organized. So oftentimes, news stories start with the most crucial information, then they would add details about particular events they're reporting on, and then eventually later on towards the end of the article, which some audiences might not read, we might learn more about context or additional information. So of course the placing or the structure of a story very, very well affects the shaping of opinions and assumptions that the readers might have about that particular event. Then we can also look into headlines, and this is of course very crucial because research has shown that the majority of people might skim through headlines and read headlines and get an idea before they actually read individual news stories, and headlines are very crucial in constructing approval or condemnation about particular causes. They can create sensation or interest, of course, disinterest, and they can reveal and hide again. Let's have a look. Sure. Let's have a look and have a couple of examples about Shirin Abu Akleh, who was killed by the Zionist occupation forces recently. But let's have a look at this headline from Fox News. So it says, Al Jazeera reporter dies following disputed incident in the West Bank. And then it says Israel, that's a category. And then we learned that another journalist for a different outlet, we don't know which, was also struck by survived. So very interesting here. If we're reading this headline, we don't know what actually happened. The reporter died, we don't know how, and there was a disputed incident. Incident could mean a lot of things depending on how the reader is going to interpret it, but it is disputed, so we get the idea that there's more than one narrative to it. So it's not really clear. We don't understand that this journalist was killed in cold blood by the occupation forces if we look at this headline. This is a headline from Mondoweiss, the outlet I mentioned earlier. Here we have a very different language, but we're referring to the same event. It says, Israel kills veteran Al Jazeera correspondent Shirin Abu Akleh in occupied West Bank. So we have different information here. We know that it was Israel, quote unquote, that killed this journalist. We know who the perpetrator was. We know that the journalist was killed and did not just die, right? We're thinking about death, die, passed away, very passive euphemism, killed, more of a concrete verb here. And we also learned that the West Bank is occupied, which we don't understand from the first headline. And then another one, very brief and concise, by the electronic intifada, Israel attacks Shirin Abu Akleh's funeral, that happened later on. And we'll look later on at other examples of Western media and how this funeral was covered. So we can see here how again, just very brief headlines can already introduce or maybe distort context of particular situations. And of course, beyond that, what is obviously very crucial is the language. So the words that we have, as we've seen here, die and kill, can mean the same things, but also can mean very different things. So connotations and denotations of words are crucial. Metaphors, of course, are used a lot in media reporting. We sometimes think of metaphors as rhetorical means in poetry or in prose, but as has been shown in research and linguistic research, especially by George Lakoff, who has done a lot of great work about conceptual metaphors, and has showed how we are using metaphors in our daily language, because the world we live in is too complex for us, which is why we are using necessarily metaphors in order to make particular or complex concepts easier for ourselves to grasp. So much of our everyday understanding works through comparisons and categories that we construct unconsciously, and this of course also plays a major role in the construction of bias. And euphemisms, as we've seen, right? Kill, die, pass away, very different verbs to refer to the same event. And again, in the case of Palestine, we can have clash as a euphemism for genocide, which is another more of a maybe extreme example but two very different words that might refer to the same event. Also, if we're thinking about apartheid wall versus separation fence, and so on. Titles, of course, play a major role. So, what labels are used? Usually nouns, sometimes adjectives and qualifiers with nouns to refer to people, places. So think again about a resistance movement versus a terrorist organization, or freedom fighters, or government versus regime, and what connotations these words might have, especially if they're attributed and identified repeatedly to particular people. And of course, pictures, statistics, and source control, who is quoted when and where, and whose ideas or information does a news story rely on in order to convey their content to their audience. So, long story short, all of this, of course, is extremely important, and for us and for our abilities to detect and dismantle bias, not only for our individual media literacy, but also as we move on and consume media in our daily lives. To give you another example of the titles, look here at this is part of an AP article from 2000. Actually, it's referring to 2014 when Michael Brown was killed in Missouri Ferguson by police. And here, Michael Brown, who was 18 years old, is referred to as an unarmed 18-year-old black man. Now, recently there was a shooting of a white supremacist in Buffalo, I think, who was the same age, where the AP refers to him as a white teenager. So we have two people who, in the same country, with the same age, but one is referred to as a black man, the other is referred to as a white teenager. Now, a teenager could be a 13-year-old child, we don't know. But this is just an example of how a title may construct some sort of bias or implications for, again, for the audience that might not read the entire article here. Another example here, both from The Guardian. So we'll look at a first report. It says, Russian reporter killed in Kiev shelling is fifth journalist to die in conflict. And we learn in the first paragraph of this article that it was Russian forces that killed this Russian journalist who was working for an opposition outlet in Russia. But it's clearly identified here that this takes place in Ukraine and that the reporter is killed. Now, if we look at the other headline from the same news outlet, so we read Al Jazeera accuses Israeli forces of killing journalists in West Bank. Similar situation, very different wording, because here it is Al Jazeera's accusation that is the headline, not the actual killing of the journalist. And then the first thing we read is Israel, quote unquote, has said she may have been hit by Palestinian fire. So an example of source control where the first source that is being cited is the official source of the apartheid regime. And if a reader is only, again, to read or to skim through the headline, they will not be aware of something that's actually been audiovisually documented, which is the actual killing by the occupation forces of this journalist. And we can look more into detail, and there's a lot to analyze here. So we see that she's standing in Jerusalem, which is under, according to international law, under illegal Israeli occupation, East Jerusalem in particular, and yet the category here is Israel. So again, this creates the picture that Jerusalem is in Israel. So the bias can take place at one moment in many different forms. And we'll look into a couple of other examples. So the term clashes, of course, has been used very often to refer to the situation in Palestine. If we look at this first headline here from the Associated Press, we read that clashes erupt at Jerusalem Holy Site, over 150 Palestinians injured. Do we know who injured whom? I don't know. And we hear that over 150 Palestinians are injured, but information we don't really get. So the noun here is clashes erupt. We think of erupt as something very passive. We might think of something that erupts in nature, like a volcano, for example. Again, another clash, Israelis and Palestinians from New York Times, clash around Jerusalem's old city. Again, we don't know why are they clashing, who is clashing, why, it's not really clear. And then also from the AP, we learn here that the holy city of Jerusalem has triggered some sort of Israeli-Palestinian violence. So we get the idea that there's violence, there are clashes, but the context isn't there yet. And again, this is not necessarily a coincidence, it is a continuation of decades of anti-Palestinian, in this case, media reporting. And whereas there is a lot of research from the perspective of media by critical scholars about the misrepresentation of Palestine, and of course other contexts of indigenous survival and struggles, there's of course still more need for much more research, because every time there is a newsworthy event such as the recent killing of Shireen, we have more and more data of bias that urgently needs to be analyzed. And again, I have so many examples here of clashes. Again, the AP, and what is also important if we think about political economy, the AP reaches, according to itself, according to its website, the AP reaches approximately half of the world's population. It's a news agency that produces news reports that are being used by many other news outlets. So it does have a very wide reach by reaching approximately half of the world's population every day. And here the AP is telling us that clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians at Al-Aqsa Mosque, a major holy site in Jerusalem, have wounded at least 20 Palestinians. It was not immediately clear what sparked the violence. So it really remains a mystery, we don't know. But we know that clashes have wounded Palestinians. So it's not Israelis have wounded Palestinians, it is clashes. Again, very particular wording that we see here. In the second example, dozens of Palestinians wounded as Israeli police entered Temple Mount. Again, we don't know how they were wounded, maybe they stumbled and fell. It remains a mystery. So, as I mentioned, this is, and again, I'm focusing on Palestine, not only because this is a major case of colonized language, colonized discourse, and colonized media, but also because much of what is wrong in the media representation of Palestine can be connected to the media representation of other contexts, including Lebanon, of course. So just to give you a very, very brief overview of what recent research has showed us on the media representation of Palestine, and as I mentioned, a lot of research has been conducted. We've seen that there has been a consistent erasure of Palestinian narratives in mainstream Anglophone Western media, but not only there. Research has showed that there is a misuse of language which has shaped the representation and the reporting of what media oftentimes refers to as conflict. And research also showed that there is an alignment of language in mainstream US newspapers with the Israeli perspective. To give you an example of the New York Times, again, one of the widest circulated newspapers worldwide, for one study that analyzed the representation of the First and Second Intifada in the New York Times showed that more than 90% of the articles in the New York Times referenced Israelis, but less than half even mentioned Palestinians. And the New York Times was, according to another study, 2.5 times more likely to position Palestinians as aggressors and Israelis as victims in its headlines than to do the opposite. And of course, go back to the issue of language. The previous study also showed that there's a disproportionate use of the passive voice when referring to violent actions perpetrated against Palestinians, as we've seen just now with Israeli soldiers enter or the journalist dies rather than is killed. Let's have a look together at one or two articles and see how actually those individual forms of bias are constructed. So this is from the AP from April 25th, 2021. If you remember, a situation very similar to the situation this year where during Easter celebrations and Ramadan, Israeli occupation forces attacked Palestinians in holy places. And here, this is from the AP. The headline is, Jerusalem tension triggers Gaza-Israel fire exchange. We have a picture that I don't know if you can read the caption. It says Israeli border police patrol the old city of Jerusalem as worshippers arrive for Friday prayers during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. On Friday, April 23rd, 2021, Israeli police say 44 people were arrested and 20 officers were wounded in a night of chaos in Jerusalem, where security forces separately clashed with Palestinians angry about Ramadan restrictions and Jewish extremists who held an anti-Arab march nearby. So what do we see here? First of all, of course, the headline. So it is again the tension, which is the noun here, and it triggers Gaza-Israel fire exchange. So the bias is implicit in the fact that there is a parity of power exchange, and Gaza-Israel, within one word, implies that there is an exchange between two sides, and tension. So again, tension, we can think about euphemisms. Is tension, what kind of word is this? What kind of connotation does it have, rather than attack or anything else? So the word choice here and the headline, of course, play a major role in how bias is constructed. If you look at the picture, we see Israeli soldiers and civilians walking side by side. We don't really see violence. So there's a conscious choice probably made here about which picture exactly to show, to depict that situation. And I think many of us might have actually seen pictures of what was going on and how violent, physically violent the situation was, in particular for Palestinians. And then of course the caption, because again it is mentioned that Palestinians were clashing and that there were Jewish extremists who held an anti-Arab march is only mentioned in the very last words of this caption. So again, the word choice here plays a role. Let's have a look at the beginning of this article. So it says here, rocket fire from the Gaza Strip toward Israel resumed Saturday evening and so on. So the beginning is rocket fire from the Gaza Strip toward Israel. So if I'm reading this, my understanding is Gaza is attacking Israel, and Gaza and Israel are probably two different places, and there is rocket fire. So this is placed at the very beginning, and then we have another example. As we mentioned, the bias through titles and attributes. We have here militants in the Gaza Strip. And they fired 3 dozens of rockets into Israel. So again, Gaza and Israel are presented as two individual places, which of course they are not. Under international law, Gaza is under Israeli occupation, and there is no border between 48 Palestine and Gaza. There is a blockade. And the statistics. So we hear there's 3 dozens of rockets that went into Israel, but we don't know how many rockets or whatever was fired against Palestinians in Gaza, against Palestinian refugees. So we can omit statistics, but media can omit statistics and include others. Let's have another look at the same paragraph and look at the language in particular. And let's identify what are the nouns, verbs, and objects that are being used in this report. So again, it starts here with rocket fire being our subject, and then from the Gaza Strip toward Israel could be the indirect object or the attribute of time. In the second sentence, our subject is tensions in Jerusalem prompted the heaviest cross-border violence in months. Again, this is a false information. There is no border. Under international law, there is no border between Gaza and so-called Israel. And then we have a sentence within a sentence here. Of course, Palestinians clashed with Israeli police and far-right Jewish groups. So we will look at the nouns. The nouns are, or the subjects in this case, are rocket fire, tensions in Jerusalem, and Palestinians. The nouns are not Israel, for example. And this, of course, plays a major role in how the grammar and the syntax of a sentence and how this is being read and perceived by the audience. So we'll look at the second sentence. Militants fired a rocket. Subject, militants, fired, verb, a rocket is our object, toward this town in southern Israel. Again, very close to Gaza, whereas Palestinians might not consider this to be southern Israel, but part of Palestine. Again, bias on different levels. And again, we have the militants in the Gaza Strip who fired sun doesn't rocket. So if we just identify, and this is something we can do in our everyday lecture of media when we're reading, identify the subjects, the verbs and the nouns and their connotations, and look into who is doing what to whom, and I think this might indicate a lot of bias already before we even go into the details. And then of course what the Israeli military then did, so once we have the Israeli military as a subject, it struck back at targets. So the population in Gaza is oftentimes constructed as a target for military. And target, of course, as a word, again, we could analyze, can have many implications. And then it continues with the barrage of rocket fire came as hundreds of Palestinians clashed with Israeli police in East Jerusalem. Again, the idea is Palestinians are attacking Israeli police, that Israel is a nuclear-armed first world superpower with one of the largest militaries in the world, and Palestinians are a defenseless population is not clear, of course, from this entire report. Now, many other, of course, similar examples, such as here, many injured on second night of clashes. This is from the BBC, which tells us that Palestinians hurled stones at the police at Damascus Gate in the Old City, and officers responded with stun grenades. So the idea here is Palestinians attacked Israeli officers who had to respond. Then what was going on, of course, in Sheikh Jarrah is that Israeli police, according to, again, the BBC, is evicting Palestinians. Evict, I looked up the definition, could be a synonym for expel, but it's more likely to identify a legal component or in a legal dimension, a land dispute, or to recover property from a person by legal process. So you might get the understanding here that these Palestinians didn't pay their rent and they need to be evicted because they're living illegally somewhere. We do not understand that it's a settler colonial genocide. Another example, a Palestinian family threatens to burn Sheikh Jarrah home in eviction standoff. So here, this article focuses on this Palestinian family that wants to burn their own home rather than to accept the Israelis taking it away. So the framing is around the action of this family, again, not about the fact that this is settler colonialism. And so many other examples that, of course, by the ways I want to show you, extend beyond those particular newsworthy events that we identified. This is, for example, from Al Jazeera from August 2021. Israel attacks Hamas sites in Gaza in response to fire balloons. And again, this is from a pan-Arab news outlet that, again, shows that Israel is attacking in response. Or France 24, Israel bombs Gaza in response to violent border clashes. Again, a border that does not exist. Now, I have hundreds of other examples, but I'll move on with another detail to look into how this bias is constructed. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different factors that play a role in the construction of different forms of bias, and the political economy and the ownership of media is one of them. And I would like to demonstrate this on the example of the German state media Deutsche Welle, which, again, I think we mentioned at the previous point throughout this workshop, is a media outlet that has been in the news in the past months because it has fired several journalists from Arab countries or of Arab origin, accusing some of them of anti-Semitism. And I'd like to refer to this situation, again, from 2021. We can discuss this together, where a very prominent Palestinian journalist was invited by Deutsche Welle to comment on the Israeli attacks against Palestinians in Al-Quds. And he basically made the point that Germany should stop making Palestinians pay for German crimes. Now, he was asked the question of whether both sides should look for calm and peace, and he made this point very clear that it is the European Union and Western regimes that are funding the Israeli regime with arms, and that there is no parity of power. What happened shortly after is that Deutsche Welle removed this interview and issued a statement saying that an activist, I'm quoting, an activist made anti-Semitic remarks and wanted to justify acts of terrorism, and removed the video from their archive. And of course, the same journalist was smeared by other German language, German media outlets, including the major German media outlet Bild, as an anti-Semite. In response to this, Deutsche Welle also issued an internal sort of style guide that was leaked eventually on social media, in which it instructed its staff how to report on Palestine and not to use the terms apartheid, colonialism, or colonialists, claiming that Germany had a special responsibility towards Israel, and so on. Why I'm mentioning this because this shows, again, the relation between politics, economy, and the actual news content and news reporting. Now, when it comes to Deutsche Welle, this is again, having this as an example, a news outlet that is funded by the German regime. So it is a state media. And if you remember, I think Dr. King showed us last week a couple of examples of media outlets and how they are labeled by social media companies as Iranian state-funded, Russian state-funded, but this does not apply to most of the Western state-funded media, including Deutsche Welle, which is not labeled as state media by Twitter, even though it is, and it is very transparent about its funding. This is from Deutsche Welle's own website. And so we have a funding here that comes from the state, and then in the case of Germany, of course, what we need to be aware of is that Germany has that Zionism is structurally inherent in the German political system and the German political spectrum from the far right to the so-called left. Just a very brief recent visit of the German foreign minister to occupied Palestine, in which she reiterated that the so-called security of quote-unquote Israel is and remains Germany's raison d'etre. So the general political idea in Germany is that Germany's existence bases itself on the so-called security of the Zionist entity. So just having in mind some historical or political dimensions and developments, and of course can very well shape how particular media, in this case the state media, that is still very widely read and exists in different languages, including German, English, and Arabic, might eventually end up forming bias in their news stories. And let's have a look at this. So this is from the German version of Deutsche Welle, which in this article says that the Al Jazeera reporter was killed in a military incident, so here it says that the known journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, suffered in clashes between Israel's army and Palestinians in Jenin in the West Bank, a deadly injury. So it's not really clear. We could maybe interpret that she was fighting against the Israeli army and she died as a result of that. And this still does not really become very clear in this article. So again, she died from a head injury according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Here, another example of Deutsche Welle. It says, and this is quite, so it says here, Shireen Abu Akleh worked for more than 25 years for the Qatari news channel Al Jazeera. Herself a Christian Palestinian, she lived and worked in East Jerusalem. As a journalist, she was primarily interested in the Near East conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. One could, of course, frame this otherwise and write she was a victim of Israeli genocide. But again, language, very particular language, that makes us understand she was a journalist who had an interest in this so-called conflict. Maybe she didn't have anything to do with it, we don't know. And the same with her funeral, where according to Deutsche Welle, a conflict erupted as the coffin was carried outside of the church, but again, we don't know how this conflict erupted. Speaking of political economy, again, much of this language is very dominant, and it is also present in the political discourse, again, when it comes to Palestine in particular. So this language around clashes, around conflicts, has been part and parcel of as I have referred to it, as a copy-pasting of European diplomacy. If we look at official statements from EU or Western governments, we oftentimes find very similar wording. So this is the EU spokesperson who says that the EU follows with deep concern the latest upsurge of violence in West Bank and clashes at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Violence must stop immediately, status quo must be respected, and leaders must act. All sides need to de-escalate. The UK tells us, or the UK consulate finds those scenes very disturbing and urges calm and restraint. So again, very passive, very diplomatic language, and of course is biased because this is also very similar language that the Zionist regime uses, such as conflict, rather than maybe much more explicit language that actually refers to settler colonialism. So just to give you an example of how we also need to analyze media within the political economy, within the media system, but also within the political framework where this media comes from and where the funding for that media is taken from. I'll just skip this for the sake of time, but just a couple of other examples, of course, from Germany. Last week, as you know, May 15 is the commemoration of the Nakba, the genocide of Palestinians, still ongoing, but the commemoration of the events of 1948, when the majority of Palestinians were expelled by Zionist militias from their home. And this coincided, of course, with the killing of Shirin. What happened in Germany was that the police in Berlin was at one point arresting anyone who was wearing a keffiyeh or a Palestinian flag or was in any way visibly Palestinian, and the German police has also banned, in this case, a Jewish pro-Palestinian group from commemorating Shirin's death publicly. So again, just to add more of a context for this very particular geographic context in the political economy, which of course might be very different in all other countries and other media outlets and related to the media systems that they operate in. And again, many more examples of this police violence against Palestinian protesters and the very visible and clear restriction of democracy and freedom of speech in Germany when it comes to not only the crimes against Palestinians, but Germany's direct involvement in the genocide of the Palestinian people. But why? So we talked about bias in terms of language, media systems, and political economy. But again, why is all of this? And what exactly does media or dominant media copy-paste from, as I've called it? And in order to talk more about this, we need to look into the Orientalist archive. So here we have three different title pages from the Time magazine, again from different eras, and we see Orientalism displayed here. We see different forms of representation of people from this region as either angry and where the US needs to stop the rage, but the question is, can the US stop the rage? Or bombed, as in the Palestinians, and here it says how the bloody cycle of attack and revenge is changing every aspect of an ancient society. Or again, the Arab guerrilla, right? We have different, throughout decades, different representations of people from this region as victims of violence, as perpetrators of violence, and I think the second shows it very well, very symbolic of much of this representations, as entrenched in this cycle of violence that is never ending, but we don't really see the causes and consequences in this visual racist representation. And I think we'll just briefly talk a bit about Orientalism, because this is where this representation comes from, and the dominance of Orientalism and its reproduction in different forms continuously makes this also very, very strong. Hope that we're all, or more or less, familiar with Edward Said and with his great work of Orientalism. which he, of course, has defined in many different ways, one of which is, of course, a sign of European Atlantic power over the Orient, right? So the area, and this, what we see here, in many ways is constructed in the media, in the academic, and the political discourse in the West, but is not necessarily a representation of the actual reality. And Edward Said referred to this as a created body of theory and practice. And these Orientalist representations, of course, are packed with stereotypes, generalizations, and dehumanization, not only to exclude the other, or to even construct the other, in this case to construct Palestinians, as the other, as the antonym to oneself, but also to brand or to identify the white person as superior, as morally superior, as more intelligent, as wise, as modern, and so on. And this, of course, has been very important for the Western West in the region geographically, but also for its political dominance in the region and beyond, and again, for the construction of itself, for the construction of whiteness as something that's supposed to be the opposite of everything that is constructed as to be the other or to be the inferior one elsewhere. And as mentioned, this is something that is consistently perpetuated through academia and media. Just to briefly refer to a work from another great scholar, Jack Shaheen, who, in case you're familiar with his work, of course wrote this very long encyclopedia called Real Bad Arabs, in which he analyzed and very clearly demonstrated the misrepresentation of Arabs and of people deemed to be Arabs in Western or US cinema. And he started his essay with this proverb, right? Which, I mean, basically it's it is the repetition. It teaches the donkey, but what would be in English repetition? Exactly, but there's an English proverb, practice. Exactly, right, that would be the English translation. And what he meant by it is that it is this constant repetition that is being used as a teaching tool by the media, in this case in particular by Hollywood, in this violent representation that has been omnipresent. So the indoctrination, again, of Arabs as less than human, as less than something else, as less than human, and as constructing them as others, as something else, has been there for over a century. And this, of course, also influences the media bias and the representation of Arabs and of other populations deemed to be inferior. So, again, a teaching tool that obviously has negatively affected the media literacy in the West. Now, I would like to add some additional examples because, as I mentioned here, obviously, this work by Said and Shaheen was focusing mostly on the Arab world, or on whatever is considered as Arab in the West, and it includes oftentimes the equation of Arabs and Islam, Iranians as Arabs, and so on. But not only. Let's have a look at China, another example of a civilization considered to be Eastern. It has been othered throughout time in US media. Just to give you again a couple of pictures from The Economist. So what we see here is a visual, obviously bias, or maybe even more than bias, in which China is shown as a dragon, oftentimes, as related to some sort of money or conspiracy that has designs in Europe. China, not America, will decide the fate of the planet, so it's constructed as a danger, right? The Chinese virus, quote unquote, China is buying up the world, all this fear-mongering. I have more. China's dangerous Taiwan temptation, how China gets American companies. This is not dystopian fiction, this is China, the Chinese threat to American speech, an assertive China challenges the West. China is taking its ideological fight abroad, why Europe will choose the US over China, and so on. And what we see here are, of course, visual dehumanizations of an entire nation. The dragon, the evil dragon that's going to steal our money, that is going to destroy our democracy, and so on. And of course, China's long arm reaches into American campuses, according to Bethany, And as we can see here, and since we are at the American campus, be careful when you leave the room or go outside not to be caught by this Chinese dragon on our campus. The case of Russia is oftentimes this depiction, again, long arms. This one is a caricature from 1878, just to give you an idea of how long such dehumanizations and depictions actually can survive. Okay. And of course, this is something that has been there. Sorry, I'm just reading a slide. Something that has been there throughout. Again, as Jegic has demonstrated, it is the repetition and it is the reproduction again from the same structures in different forms. And I would like to conclude just briefly by discussing colonialism very briefly in relation to this idea of bias. So we looked into how clashes and confrontations have been two of the dominant terms employed to talk about Palestine in this case. But there are many other terms that shape the everyday reality, not only of Palestine, but also beyond, that are not part, that are being left out in this bias of selection, bias of word choice, bias by headline. And this is, as we can start, for example, with settler colonialism. The fact that the situation in Palestine, as it is today, is a result of over a century of European colonialism. The Zionist colonial movement has very early on identified itself as a colonial movement that wants to establish a white colony, a European colony in this region. So in many ways it is media that oftentimes, again in the case of Palestine, distorts between the actual political ideologies of Zionism that are quite transparent, the suffering of Palestinians, translates this into a clash or chaos. Replacement here is a major issue. The entire idea of the Zionist colony has been to replace the indigenous population with the settler community, as has been the case in many other cases of colonialism. And as I've called it, it's a simultaneous process of settler colonial inscription and indigenous erasure. It takes place at the same time, and one cannot be disconnected from the other. Scholars have referred to it as the logic of elimination, because settler colonialism is genocidal in its core. It aims to kill and to remove the indigenous person, because what does an indigenous person have to do to become a threat? They have to just remain at home. And in this case, any Palestinian living on their land and existing in Palestine is already a threat through their mere existence. And this is actually where we might apply the term of conflict, because for the Zionists this is a conflict. They want to take the land, but there is still an indigenous population. So here if we think about settler colonial advance and indigenous erasure, then we might actually discuss to what extent the term conflict might even make sense in these dimensions. And of course, that the entire existence of the so-called State of Israel necessitates violence and necessitates perpetual warfare in and beyond Palestine, including in Lebanon, again, which was under Zionist occupation and continues to be a target of Zionist violence for over 74 years now. And if we have such visual representations, they make this very clear. We have a map here of Palestine from 1980 until this decade that makes it very clear how the settler colonial advance has been working, and that puts genocide practically into a picture. But again, if we contrast this to the pictures that we've seen in these media reports of Israeli soldiers peacefully walking side by side with civilians, two very, very different situations. So again, the continuous perpetuation of colonialism or legitimization of colonialism through the omission of mentioning colonialism in the dominant media discourse in this case. And I'll just briefly like to refer to one work by Fayez, who wrote this brilliant book in the 1960s, The Zionist which is called Zionist colonialism in Palestine. And I'm referring to this for numerous reasons. First of all, of course, because it's a very great and brief identification of what Zionism actually is and what it means to Palestinians as the indigenous people, but also because this book was published by the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization Research Center in Beirut, Lebanon. And in 1982, when the Zionist forces invaded Lebanon and advanced to Beirut in the summer of '82, obviously one of the many crimes that they committed, one of the many things goals that they had was to remove Palestinian presence from Lebanon. So they looted this research center, confiscated or stole thousands of books, and then bombed the center altogether, which is in this case, a transnational form of violence, destruction of archives, destruction of Palestinian media, and of Palestinian narratives, literature, and scholarly work. Which we can also relate, by the way, again, to what is going on today in Palestine with the settler fear of the native. But I'm referring to this book just because I think was published half a century ago, and it in very clear and simple language identifies the actual essence of the Zionist colony and how the idea of building an actual nation was part, or has been all along, part and parcel of the Zionist colonial project, and how, again, referring to the original ideas of Zionism that Zionists were very transparent about, how the so-called State of Israel has been implemented as a Western colony, as an extension of European whiteness into this part of the world, and how racism is not an acquired trait, but it is not accidental, it is essential. The entire idea of Zionism is based on race theory. And again, just wanted to demonstrate this because if we look at those headlines of clashes, and I'll get to this in a second, but I have just to show you, to refer to this current moment that we had with Shireen being killed. Again, if we look at these headlines, from these historical dimensions that we looked into, the political economy, the funding, and the media systems, see a very, very obvious discrepancy, right? Between this journalist that was killed while covering a raid, or journalist killed during raid, reporter killed, and the actual situation of settler colonial genocide. So eventually, and I'm going to conclude by just identifying, or by suggesting some ways that would help us to dismantle this bias. It's a picture from 1948 during the Nakba, during the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland, and also something that's referred to as an ongoing era of genocidal erasure. But so conflict and clash, again, could be two words that are heavily biased, but why don't we talk about war? Why is the situation in Palestine not described as a war in mainstream media? Why is colonialism not talked about? Settler colonialism, apartheid. We've reached a point in 2022 where even neoliberal Western NGOs and human rights organizations have identified apartheid as the fundamental structure of the Zionist entity. Why is apartheid still not in the headlines? Genocide. A lot of research has identified ethnic cleansing as a euphemism for genocide. A lot of research, including by Israeli scholars, has been conducted on how the situation in Palestine is referred to, constitutes a genocide, or as I've called it in my work, Palestinicide, multidimensional form of genocide. And why is it terrorism, not resistance, is my concluding question. And I want to end by referring to a UN resolution from 1982, because as we've also seen, international law is not necessarily present in this bias reporting on Palestine. We've seen examples of how East Jerusalem might be identified as quote-unquote Israel, even though it is occupied Palestine. There were several UN resolutions dealing with the situation in Palestine, as well as in Lebanon, and with indigenous genocide. And this is a resolution from 1982 that was passed in December, and this was briefly after the another resolution had identified the crime that took place in Sabra and Shatila in September of 1982 as a genocide that was committed by the Lebanese forces militia against Palestinian refugees. So within this context, we have this resolution that has reaffirmed indigenous peoples' right to armed resistance, to use all means at their disposal in order to liberate themselves and to fight against an occupying power. And this explicitly applies to Palestinians. So even under this international law and the UN, Palestinians do have the right to use arms against the occupier. And I'm just going to end here because I think this is a very powerful example of something that is completely omitted in that news bias. And I have hundreds of more examples of clashes and mysteries, but I'm going to end here. Thank you so much for your attention.
شكرا لك على هذا التفكيك المتقن حقيقة للتحيز الإعلامي، لكن أود السؤال أن من يقرر أن هذا تحيزا إعلاميا، فما نحن نراه تحيزا يراه الآخر مهنيا.
Just a second. Nur?
شكرا لك على هذا التفكيك التحيز الإعلامي، لكن من يقرر أن هذا تحيزا إعلاميا، فما نحن نراه تحيزا يراه الآخر مهنية وتوازنا وحيادا. والأمر لا يتعلق أيضا بالقضية الفلسطينية وحدها وما ينتج عنها من جرائم في إعلامية تحديدا. هناك ما يحدث في القضية اليمنية أيضا، هناك ما حدث ويحدث في سوريا، هناك ما جرى أيضا في العراق على مدار 30 عام. المنطقة كلها عانت من التحيز الإعلامي، فمن يحدد أن هذا تحيزا أولا؟ وأيضا في الجهة الأخرى هناك دور للممولين. الممول ماذا يفعل في مجال التحيز الإعلامي، وكيف سنستطيع التغلب على هذا التحيز وتقف خلفه دول كبرى وأيضا شركات مالية ورجال أعمال يملكون من المال الكثير. شكرا.
Great. Shall I answer this or take more questions? Yeah. Okay, let's have more questions and then.
شكرا دكتور دانيال على المحاضرة القيمة. أنا سؤالي إنه شو العوامل اللي بتشوفها بتجمع بين وسائل الإعلام الأوروبية في التحيز؟ هل هي يعني الخوف من اللاسامية، من التمويل المالي للمؤسسات الإعلامية؟ ليش مثلا دير شبيغل اللي بتختلف عن دوتشي فيلا بيعملوا نفس الكونتنت عن المحتوى الفلسطيني؟ شو العوامل اللي بتحس إنها تقف خلف هذا التحيز؟
Well, just so we only have like 3 or 4 minutes left, and we cannot exceed, so maybe we can also, maybe just one last question and I'll comment.
I believe that the Western world population, like normal people, will not have sympathy for Arabs because all of the media, the Hollywood, all the industry, they do not see us as a human, they see us as potential threat. Because this is how, not because they are bad people, because this is how media and everything around them reflects it. My question is, how can we stand and say the truth? How can we make them see our point of view, since it is a lobby? It is a very American-specific Israel lobby. What will be the tools for us to use?
Yep. So thank you for your questions. I think those are very important questions that we need to ask ourselves and need to try to find solutions to. When it comes to, and I think those issues are connected. So we talked about Orientalism. Orientalism is that widespread and engraved in Western, not only, as I mentioned, not only in the depictions of the other and the dehumanization of other populations, but also in the construction of the white Western self as a superior opposite. Media, the funding, obviously, the political components, the regimes, their identities, their individual reasons why they support the Zionist entity, the militarization, military-industrial complex, colonialism, imperialism, all of these factors have structural violence, and they all come together. To refer to that question, someone asked what we can do is, I mean, there's a lot of great work of media activism. There's a lot that we can do as people who create media, people who discuss media, but it is an ongoing battle, just as justice, liberation are ongoing struggles. And because these things reappear in different ways. One thing I wanted to initially include in this presentation, but I didn't for the sake of time, is this ongoing conspiracy theory right now we have in Lebanon about a so-called Iranian occupation of Lebanon, which I urge anyone who has the time to analyze this, because what we see is the reproduction of 40 years of anti-Iranian news bias from a Zionist perspective, reproduced and made fit for the current Lebanese political context, to an extent where, if you hashtag Iranian occupation of Lebanon on Twitter or on social media, you'll find hundreds of results of actual people, including entertainers with 15 million followers, asking the international community to intervene to liberate us from the Iranian occupation of Lebanon. So it reproduces. We have structures that get reproduced that might even seem ridiculous. Exactly. And so and again, this repetition. So it requires a lot of effort. Yeah. I think I need to stop. Thank you, everyone.